And let's get into this story as well. Anti-racism campaigners have reported more than 20 Conservative councillors to the party's Islamophobia inquiry, as polling suggests nearly half of Tory members think Islam is incompatible with British life. Hope Not Hate identified dozens of Tory members using social media to express anti-Muslim sentiment in its submission to the inquiry, which was set up last year to examine claims of discrimination in the party. The group also commissioned a YouGov poll of more than 1,200 Tory members and found 47% thought that Islam was generally a threat to the British way of life, compared to 27% thinking it was generally compatible. Let's speak to Miqdaad Versi, who's a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Give us your initial thoughts on what you make of this.
I think this is really quite illuminating for many people who aren't aware of this. I mean, for many Muslims who've been campaigning on this issue for a long time, these are unfortunately not shocking. These are figures that corroborate what we've been saying in the past. You know, when almost 60% of Conservative Party members believe conspiracy theories about Muslims, about Sharia no-go zones where non-Muslims can't enter, when 57% have a negative view of Muslims versus like 22% for Jews, Sikhs and Hindus. I mean, it's astonishingly bad. And even of the figure that you cited, where 55% see Islam as a threat to our way of life here in Britain, you know, if you look at and you dig into that, they're saying, you know, half of them think that Islam breeds intolerance and calls for violence. I mean, it's 41% thinks that Islam promotes physical abuse of women like grooming gangs. I mean, this is the ruling governing party, and Islamophobia is embedded in its culture. And the fact that this is not news to me and to many of us who are in this space is one point. But in society, we have to realize how bad this is. And the fact that many of these individuals who have been highlighted by Hope Not Hate in this report, the 40 individuals who are mentioned, and the 20 who've been submitted to the inquiry, there are 300 who are in the dossier that the Muslim Council of Britain put together earlier this year. This is a serious problem. The party doesn't seem to want to deal with it, and we are in a position right now where the party seems to be ignoring all these concerns and actually deceptively acting on this by pretending that it acts swiftly, pretending that it suspends people immediately when it doesn't, pretending that it actually cares about this issue, when in reality everything shows that it doesn't. So I think that we...
Okay, I was just sorry to talk over you, Miqdaad. I was just wanted to get in a point there about you know, what constitutes somebody thinking, when you read the headline, 47% think that Islam is a general threat, our brain immediately goes to thinking, well, does that mean they think that Muslims are all suicide bombers, or Muslims are going to, you know, do something horrendous to your local area? It could just mean that lots of those people think that Islam is incompatible with culturally with British life, and depending on where you look, they might have a point. I mean, we could apply that to any religion, and I should add.
Yeah, no, exactly. But that's why this poll is interesting, because it breaks that down. It shows that of those people, half of them think that Islam calls for violence. 40% of them think that Islam promotes physical abuse of women like grooming gangs. And even like there is a section who believe that Muslims are out there trying to replace law with Sharia law. Like, now, if that is what...
Well, that's because there might be small in numbers, but we know there are some Muslims who do advocate that.
To say that's...
We've had people preaching in the streets legitimately in this country, advocating that. We know, and because I've spoken to you guys before, we have too many imams and too many people who aren't necessarily officiated in any specific way with certain mosques or areas who do spew this bile, not in your name, but hasn't Islam
to our British way of life? If someone is on the street,
agreed.
If someone is on the street shouting on the street, I mean, we see so many people who cranks and clowns and whatever they might be on the street saying things. That's the question we're talking about is why does our governing party specifically have its membership filled with people who have such hostile views towards Muslims?
I think the reason we might be able to answer that, and I'm no pollster or expert on these cultural issues, But the only thing I can think is that conservatives are perhaps more traditional, and when they see traditional values compromised, whether it's a perception or a reality, and arguably in this case it is more the former, then they are more likely to react to that. So when you take something like grooming gangs, I mean, I think you could concede, Miqdaad, that there was a ring of silence around that. And of course, that wasn't about, and should never be described as it was done in the name of Islam or anything like that. But there were some of those perpetrators who claimed that it was their almost religious right or directive to do what they did. They falsely claimed that, but they claimed it nonetheless. And as a result of that, we had disproportionality in that particular group of offenders. And there was a sense that the Islamic community, the hierarchy within Islam in this country, were pretty silent on it. In fact, many believing that the wagons drew a circle around some of the perpetrators.
I recognize that Tommy Robinson and his crew have been using this issue in particular to attack Muslims, and therefore it has gained significant
but forget that lot.
But
they're irrelevant to me. They're irrelevant to me.
hand.
They're irrelevant to most people. What I'm interested in is, where were your community when those offences were going on?
I think that where was my community? I think, that type of victim blaming isn't the right way of approaching
victim.
this.
You're not the victim here. The victim were children. Children were the victim. You're not the victim here.
No,
I will give you the opportunity to rephrase that. I'm sure you meant something different.
That's not what I take that back. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm making it very clear that focusing on saying that why are Muslims not responding and not condemning and not dealing. Firstly, that's not true. Okay, it's worth noting that at the Muslim Council of Britain's annual general meeting, it was a key topic that was mentioned. We had Nazir Afzal who gave a talk. We had we had a report put out on this. We had lots and lots of Muslim communities acting on this significantly across the country. But the idea that this is a Muslim-specific issue rather than a cultural issue,
I agree with that.
A challenge. Muslim communities have actually been on the front line, despite it not being a Muslim-specific issue, as you have conceded.
Indeed, of course I concede, and simultaneously,
as we all concede.
Let me just add to that I don't think every Muslim has to apologise for every crime committed by a Muslim either, no more than I should be having to apologise for Fred and Rose West. I'm not stupid, but I think there was a sense, and I'm not just talking about Muslims, there was an awful lot of the establishment that seemed to be rather quiet on those kind of crimes. If you look
people find these things quite difficult to tackle. There were challenges of not knowing how to approach.
But we had
members of parliament
tweeting. Members of parliament tweeting that people should shut up when they talk about these issues. So we had those kind of problems.
I don't think there's a lack of people talking about this issue now. I think that there was at the initial stage, people didn't seem to be willing and able to discuss this issue for a number of different reasons. And I think that now it's really good that some of the research which has looked into this has looked and found, how the nighttime economy is a big driver and there are big challenges associated with how you deal with these things. But let's put this aside. I think these aren't what we have to understand is the Conservative Party as a whole and its membership have a disproportionately negative view about Muslims. This is unequivocal. It is proven through evidence and through this poll, through a poll which has happened before, through a number of different case studies and examples.
Some people in the Conservative Party,
Sorry, say again?
Some people in the Conservative Party.
A majority of Conservative members, according to this poll.
Yes, according to that poll. It's funny because I struggle to. I try to interview these people.
It's a YouGov poll.
I know it's not your poll. I understand that, but when I try to interview these people and I ask them, they couldn't. I mean, Ian Duncan Smith is an obvious example of what you might say a right-wing Tory. He's very proud to be British, patriot kind of character, former military man. You wouldn't get him to concur with any of this kind of stuff. So I often wonder. I wonder who these people are that sit there in this world. Maybe some little Englanders that are still out there left over from the old days, perhaps.
But if it was just a small group, it would be one issue. But it's not. This is almost 60% of members, and this is not the first time this poll has happened. And it's not just one issue. It's almost 60% believe conspiracy theories about no-go zones. Almost 60% have a negative view of Muslims. Almost 55% see Islam as a threat to our way of life.
But if you is there not something wider here, Miqdaad? And it's nobody's fault in particular. It's certainly not Muslims' fault, but it's simultaneously not people who, the traditional phrase of born and bred. I think Panorama you might be able to pick me up on this. Panorama did a documentary something like 12 years ago where they went to a place somewhere, I think it was Bradford, I think it was that neck of the woods, and they went to a community where there was the white indigenous community, to use that phrase advisedly, and then there was the Muslim community, and it was a kind of divided town, and no one was hurting each other, no one was killing each other, they were kind of rubbing along, but they didn't have anything in common. There was no assimilation, there was no cohesion between the two. And the Panorama programme, I'm sure it was Panorama, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, went back 10 years later to see if that had changed. And it hadn't changed. Now, nothing bad was happening, but simultaneously, you can imagine why some people look at that and say, that is kind of incompatible, because there's a community almost ghettoized, living on their own. It identified, Louise Casey in her report identified the disproportionate amount of particularly Muslim women in this country, Bangladeshi of origin, mostly not speaking English, not even as a second language, not able to speak that. It's those kind of things perhaps that maybe feed into this idea that Muslims are a threat, when in fact what they really mean is that we don't have the cohesion between the two communities that some people sense they get with other communities. Would that be fair?
So I think if one were to look at these things in isolation, people can get certain conclusions. What we need to look at is data, look at evidence rather than these narratives that have been created. So, for example, the University of Manchester looked at how different faith groups are spread across the country. Are they spread out, or are they all in certain areas and isolated from one another? It's what they call the index of dissimilarity, okay? And what they found was that Jewish communities were the most isolated, followed by Sikh communities, followed by Hindu and Muslim communities very similarly. And what they also noticed was that in the last 10 years, between 2001 and 2011, because there's two censuses, it's actually got much better for Muslim communities compared to some of the other faith groups that were out there. Now, these are the facts that are happening on integration. And, we can look at all of these things together and say, actually, let's talk about the positive story of the reality that we look at, that Muslim communities are actually on the front line in the NHS fighting the coronavirus that we're facing right now. Muslim communities are the taxi drivers, the service supporters.
Yeah, the police officers. I get all of that. I'm just trying to understand, because it's confused me as well. I'm a white English bloke, and it confuses me too, because I wonder about this. But then when I lived in East London, I lived in a road that was mostly Muslim. A big percentage couldn't speak the language. I had no truck with anybody. I used to have a good relationship with the family next door. But the old Cockney lady who lived below me in a flat down there, dear old Joan, wondered what on earth was going on, because she couldn't communicate with her neighbours and she didn't understand this shift and this move. That doesn't make her a mad racist, does it? That just makes her a bit confused about.
That's not the question that's been raised in any of this polling. It's not about English. And if you talk about English, actually, I think that most. Every Muslim organization I know, like most have been very, very supportive of English language classes, and were very disappointed that funding for English went down significantly, whilst at the same time this rhetoric of people not speaking English was a problem. But let's also look at the fact that historically, Muslims, migrants who came into this country, some of them didn't speak English particularly well. But actually, if you look at the figures, the largest proportion of of people who don't speak English well is actually not people who are coming from Muslim majority countries. I think a lot of them are coming from Eastern Europe. And so again, some of these things are a bit misunderstood or conflated together.
Okay.
And what we have to try and step back and say is, why are these narratives created and then propagated and embedded within certain sections of society? Because as you recognize, as we all know, that grooming gangs isn't a Muslim specific issue, terrorism isn't a Muslim specific issue, but these types of violence related ideas have been propagated.
Indeed,
and have
I get it.
Created and being sectioned in certain sections of society. And we need to recognize and ask Conservative MPs and the Conservative Party to recognize this issue and deal with it. We need political leadership, and we cannot have a situation where the governing party has such a serious problem of Islamophobia and it's not being dealt with.
All right, Miqdaad, thank you. Miqdaad Versi, who is a spokesperson for the Muslim Council of Britain. I'll throw that open to you for your response as well. I think the issue is it goes far beyond a headline of a poll. I think there's